The man who would become the ruler of the largest land empire in history started his reign by making fear his first weapon. Before his armies conquered cities, before his banners flew over empires, people knew what was coming. Because wherever Genghis Khan went, terror arrived first. No mercy from the start, the Mongol code of fear. There's no slow build here. Genghis Khan didn't ease into cruelty. He opened with it. Let's be clear. Genghis wasn't cruel for fun. He wasn't a sadist swinging blades for pleasure. His violence had purpose. To send a message. That message was simple. Resist us, and your world burns. Obey us, and maybe you live. One of his earliest examples of mass brutality came in 1201, when he was still rising to power among the Mongol tribes. After crushing a rival clan that had mocked him and killed one of his generals, he didn't just execute their leader. He boiled his enemies alive, cut their heads off, and paraded the bodies as warnings. Why? Because in the steppe world, strength wasn't proven by winning battles. It was proven by how you ended your enemies. And once he unified the Mongol tribes under his name, the torture methods only grew darker. Take Nishapur, in modern-day Iran. The city had surrendered to the Mongols, but when a Mongol commander was killed during occupation, Genghis Khan responded with what can only be described as pure annihilation. Historical sources say that nearly every living soul in the city was executed. Estimates range from 90,000 to over 100,000 people. Men, women, children. Some accounts even claim pyramids of skulls were built outside the city gates to send a clear message to the next town. Don't fight back. Still think this guy played around? Now here's where it gets even more disturbing. This wasn't rage. It was strategy. Genghis Khan knew that if stories of his brutality spread far enough, his enemies might surrender before the first arrow was even fired. And it worked. By the time his armies reached places like Samarkand and Bukhara, local leaders faced a brutal decision: fight and risk a massacre, or submit and maybe live under Mongol rule. And here's a mind-bender. Genghis Khan didn't always want to kill everyone. In fact, if you surrendered quickly and didn't resist, he might spare your city. He often left local administrators in charge, as long as they paid tribute. But if you hesitated, even for a day, he unleashed hell. This wasn't just about conquest. It was psychological warfare at a level rarely seen in history. Genghis made torture a tool of propaganda. Imagine living in a city and hearing that the Mongols were on their way. You'd already know what they did to your neighbors. You'd heard the stories. People tied to horses and ripped apart. Nobles buried alive. Entire villages burned to the ground while the screams echoed across the steppe. So here's a question for you. If you were a ruler in the 1200s and heard Genghis Khan was heading your way, would you fight? Or would you throw open the gates and hope for mercy? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, we want to hear your take. And hey, if this kind of raw, untold history is your thing, hit that like button and subscribe right now. We're just getting started with the darkest parts of the Mongol war machine, because what came next? It gets even worse. Death by boiling, the fate of rebels and traitors. You didn't just die for betraying Genghis Khan. You boiled, alive. Let that sink in. This wasn't some rare, isolated event. This was a punishment Genghis used specifically for people who insulted him, betrayed Mongol rule, or dared to challenge his authority. Let's talk about one of the most brutal examples. Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, a city in the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to Otrar. No weapons, no threat, just silk, spices, and silver. But Inalchuk didn't trust them. He accused the traders of spying and ordered them all to be arrested and executed. Genghis Khan demanded justice. He sent 3 diplomats to negotiate. Inalchuk responded by killing one, shaving the beards of the others, and sending them back humiliated. Big mistake. Genghis Khan launched a full-scale invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in response. But he didn't just kill Inalchuk. He made an example out of him. Historical records suggest that Inalchuk was captured and boiled alive, slowly, publicly, and painfully. Some say he was thrown into a giant cauldron of oil, others say water. Either way, the message was crystal clear. Insult the Khan, and you don't just die, you suffer. And it wasn't just governors. Traitors from within Mongol ranks, rebellious nobles, or rival leaders who broke promises often met the same fate. Stripped, tied down, and dropped into boiling liquid. Sometimes their screams were allowed to echo through the city as a warning. Other times, the executions were silent, but just as effective. Entire towns surrendered simply to avoid that kind of ending. Here's the thing. Death by boiling is one of the slowest and most excruciating punishments in human history. The skin doesn't just blister. It slides off. Your nerves don't go numb. They stay active as the flesh cooks off your bones. Genghis didn't pick this at random. He chose it because it lasted. Not just in the body, in the memory of anyone who watched. And sometimes, boiling wasn't the end. There are Mongol records of prisoners being half-boiled, pulled out, and interrogated while still alive. Skin peeling, nerves exposed, voices broken, then boiled again. Just in case they forgot who was in charge. So let's pause for a second. Was this justice, revenge, or just pure psychological domination? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Genghis was trying to prove? Because remember, this wasn't just a barbaric ruler going wild. This was the most powerful man on earth, using fire, steel, and boiling death to carve a message into history. Obey and you live. Disobey and you melt. The Sandbag suffocation, killing without spilling royal blood. Here's something brutal and oddly respectful. Genghis Khan believed that royal or noble blood should never be spilled. But he still needed to execute kings, princes, and rival leaders. So what did he do? He got creative. One of the Mongols' most disturbing execution methods involved suffocation using heavy cloth, carpets, or sandbags. It was quiet. It left no visible wounds. And it got the job done. Let's break down how it worked. When a noble enemy was captured, especially one of high lineage, Genghis wouldn't behead them or stab them on the battlefield. That would have been a spiritual offense. Mongol tradition held that the blood of noblemen was sacred, and spilling it would offend the heavens. So instead, the victim would be wrapped tightly in a thick rug or felt cloth, their arms pinned, their legs bound. Then, depending on the mood, they'd either be trampled to death by horses or crushed under the slow weight of sandbags or stone slabs. No blade, no blood, but death all the same. One of the most notorious examples was the execution of the Khwarezmian prince Jalal ad-Din's family. After Jalal fled from the Mongols, Genghis Khan hunted down his remaining relatives. Some of them, nobles, women, even children, were suffocated to death this way, their blood unspilled, their lineage erased. It wasn't just physical death. It was a symbolic erasure of status. Genghis wasn't just saying, "You die." He was saying, "Your legacy ends here, quietly, painfully, and with no glory." And this wasn't a one-off tactic. Mongol generals used it across the empire. Even Jamuka, Genghis Khan's childhood friend turned enemy, used this method. In a fit of paranoia, Jamuka once executed 70 young warriors by crushing them to death without shedding a drop of blood, a choice that horrified even hardened soldiers. Later, when Genghis captured Jamuka himself, he didn't torture him. He gave him a clean death. Why? Because Jamuka was a blood brother, someone Genghis once swore loyalty to. Even in revenge, he followed the code. That's the twisted part of this story. There was a code. The Mongols weren't mindless killers. They had rules, beliefs, even a form of dark honor. But when those beliefs led to suffocating your enemies in silence under sacks of sand just to follow tradition, you start to see how brutality and ritual blurred in Genghis Khan's world. So here's something to think about. Is it more terrifying to be killed violently, or slowly, silently, with your hands tied and no chance to scream? Comment your thoughts. Would you rather face the blade or the bag? Because this was just one version of Mongol justice. And what came during their city sieges? That was on an entirely different level. Mass starvation, plague, and the kind of cruelty that turned civilians into corpses. Let's get into it. Siege madness, starvation, disease, and pure terror. When Genghis Khan laid siege to a city, he wasn't just trying to win. He wanted the survivors, if there were any, to wish they had died sooner. He didn't need cannons or catapults with fireballs. He had hunger, disease, and psychological warfare, and he used them like surgical tools. Let's talk about what Mongol sieges actually looked like. They weren't quick. They weren't clean. They were long, drawn-out collapses of everything a city relied on: food, water, order, hope. One of the most infamous examples, the siege of Bukhara in 1220. When the Mongols arrived, Bukhara was a proud, wealthy city, heavily fortified, filled with scholars and soldiers alike. But that didn't matter. Genghis Khan surrounded it, cut off supply lines, and waited. He let fear rot the city from the inside. He used a classic trick: starve them out. People started hoarding food. Prices skyrocketed. The poor were the first to die. Not from arrows, but from empty bellies. Fights broke out over crumbs. Order fell apart. Disease crept in. Bodies piled up. And Genghis knew exactly what he was doing. He would leave just enough survivors to run and tell the next city what they saw. Let the horror spread like wildfire. Sometimes he even released captives on purpose, just so they could carry the psychological infection with them. They're coming, and they're not human. And then, there was the biological warfare. Historical reports suggest that Mongols would hurl the bodies of plague victims over city walls, a disgusting, deadly way to spread panic and disease. Not only did this make defenders sick, it made them afraid to even touch their own dead. In other sieges, they forced captives to build defenses for their enemies. Imagine this. You're captured outside a city and the Mongols tell you to start piling up corpses to build a barricade. Your own people are watching from the walls, knowing they can't help you, or they're next. Now picture this. In some cities, things got so bad that cannibalism broke out. Parents eating children, neighbors turning on each other. And the Mongols? They waited. They watched. Because when they finally breached the walls, they weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were stepping over skeletons with skin, too weak to resist. When Samarkand fell, survivors were used as human shields in the next siege. They tied prisoners to the front of siege towers so defenders couldn't shoot without killing their own. That's not just war, that's calculated cruelty. So here's the question. Is it more effective to conquer through violence, or by making your enemies break themselves before you even enter the gates? Genghis Khan knew the answer, and he used it city after city, leaving a trail of crushed morale and scorched memories. What would your city have done? Fight until the last arrow? Or surrender and hope for mercy that may never come? Because the next kind of torture Genghis used wasn't about death at all. It was about keeping people alive, just long enough to destroy them. Psychological torture, when death wasn't the worst option. Sometimes Genghis Khan didn't kill his enemies. He broke them, because once you've made someone wish for death and denied it, you've taken everything. This was the kind of torture that didn't leave blood on the floor. It left people hollow, broken minds, destroyed spirits. And Genghis knew how to make that happen. Let's talk about the survivors of his campaigns. You might think they were the lucky ones, but imagine this. You survive a siege only to be taken as a prisoner. Not for ransom, not for release, but for forced service in the Mongol army. Thousands of captured men were forced to march ahead of Mongol troops, used as meat shields in future battles. No weapons, no armor, just thrown in front of enemy archers so Mongol soldiers could stay untouched. They didn't even bother learning your name. To them, you were just a wall of dying flesh. Now imagine you're one of them, staring down a line of spears, knowing your life means absolutely nothing. Wouldn't death have been easier? But Genghis didn't stop at men. Women and children were often enslaved, and not just physically. He'd forcibly marry noble women from defeated tribes, not out of love or alliance, but as a political humiliation tactic. He once took the Tangut queen, whose people had dared to defy him, as a concubine, and then, according to some sources, had her executed after using her as a symbol of Mongol dominance. Others weren't killed. They were kept as living trophies, carted from city to city, shown off as defeated royalty stripped of status and power. And for generals or rulers who resisted, sometimes the torture was mental, forced to watch their families die, then kept alive to live with the grief. Think about that. No knife, no fire, just grief as a weapon. And here's a haunting one. Genghis would sometimes cut off the ears of prisoners and send them back to their homeland as a warning. No words, just mutilated silence. An entire army returning, silent, earless, shamed. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about broadcasting control. The Mongols had no modern media, no Twitter, no TV. But they had fear. And fear travels fast. So ask yourself this: would you rather die a warrior or live as a tool for the enemy that destroyed everything you loved? Drop your answer in the comments. No easy choices here. That's how Genghis liked it, because the final kind of torture he used was a little different. It was strange, cultural, and weirdly surgical. Let's talk about it next. You ready? Cutting the vein. Surgical torture and symbolic cruelty. Sometimes torture under Genghis Khan wasn't loud. It was precise. Instead of chopping off limbs or burning flesh, Mongol executioners were sometimes ordered to cut just enough to cause pain, but not enough to kill. The goal? Make the victim suffer slowly, symbolically, and publicly. One particular tactic was cutting the major veins, but not completely. A soldier or prisoner would be tied down, and executioners would slice open the large veins in the arms or legs. Just a little. Enough for blood to seep, not pour. The person would feel the intense sting of the blade and the warmth of blood, but they wouldn't die fast. Instead, they'd stay alive for hours, draining, weakening, watching themselves fade. Sometimes these victims were put on display outside city gates or in military camps, living warnings to anyone thinking about escape, rebellion, or resistance. It wasn't just about pain, it was a performance, a calculated ritual meant to break more than bones. For Genghis Khan, torture was never random. It was strategic, psychological, and horrifyingly deliberate. He didn't just want to destroy bodies, he wanted to destroy meaning. His use of violence wasn't sloppy rage, it was surgical terror. Pain was his scalpel, not his hammer. The Mongols knew how to keep people alive just long enough to suffer again. In many cases, prisoners were given tiny drops of water, just enough to survive. Their wounds were stitched shut, only to be cut open again the next day, over and over, until the body gave up, or the soul did. The point wasn't just to punish. It was to make every scream, every spasm, every dying breath deliver a message louder than any war drum. This is what happens when you challenge Mongol rule. But Genghis reserved his darkest methods for those he saw as dangerous symbols, not warriors, but thinkers. Priests who spoke against him, leaders who questioned him, messengers who delivered defiance. These weren't just people to be killed, they were influencers to be shattered. Genghis didn't simply silence them, he stripped away their purpose in society. He broke their identities one piece at a time. This was psychological warfare, centuries ahead of its time. The goal wasn't just death, the goal was total erasure. One of the most disturbing examples of this strategy comes from the city of Nishapur in 1221. At first, the city had surrendered to the Mongols, but when Genghis left, the people revolted. During the uprising, one of his top generals, who also happened to be his son-in-law, was killed. That was a fatal mistake. Genghis responded with fury. He ordered the complete destruction of Nishapur. Historical accounts estimate that over 100,000 people were slaughtered. But it wasn't just the death toll that made this event infamous. It was what happened to the city's heart and soul. Nishapur's scholars, poets, and philosophers, the intellectual core of the city, were treated differently. They weren't simply executed. They were mutilated in ways meant to erase their identities forever. Some were reportedly blinded so they could never read or write again. Others had their tongues cut out so they could never speak their knowledge. These weren't punishments. These were cancellations. Centuries before the word existed, Genghis didn't just kill people. He killed cultures. He erased legacies. His message was clear. Don't just kill the enemy. Kill what makes them who they are. And somehow that's more terrifying than death. Now here's the real question for you. Imagine you're a ruler back then. You've built a thriving city. You have people who depend on you. And one day you see the black banners of the Mongol horde on the horizon. You hear the drums. You remember the stories. Do you run? Do you fight? Or do you throw yourself at their feet and beg for mercy? There were no second chances. If Genghis Khan believed you were a threat, even for a moment, there was no negotiation, no appeal, no tomorrow. If you're still watching, you're clearly built for the hard truths of history. So do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to History Dictionary. We go deep into the stories that textbooks won't tell you, the bloody, brutal, shocking side of the past. And in the comments, tell us which part of Genghis's torture tactics shocked you the most. Was it the stitched-up wounds? The silenced messengers? The blinded scholars? Because next time we're going even darker, into the twisted punishments and unthinkable cruelty of history's most feared empires. Stay curious, stay brave, and stay tuned.